Hi, I'm Josh McGrath.
I'm Andrew Haas.
And this is the Art in Pursuit podcast. In our last episode, we explored what a man's response should be if a woman's parents say no to your romantic pursuit of her. Today, we are going to look at what your response should be if everyone gives the thumbs up, you've got the green light, and the go ahead. Now, it's important to note that for many men, they're the classic, mistakes, pitfalls, and problems that they will encounter along the way in their dating relationship. So over the next several weeks, we are going to devote time to unpack those in detail. However, today we're going to look at a very important conversation that must happen within the first week of your relationship. Today's episode is titled, You Need Physical Boundaries. Now, when we're talking about physical boundaries, we're really talking about the broader category of intimacy.
Yes, and to be clear, intimacy is not just physical.
Yes.
But for the sake of our discussion today, we are going to keep it narrowly focused on the physical aspect.
And the reason we're doing that is because for most men, that is something that drives a lot of their decision making.
Yes.
And something that they want to engage in. Obviously, we recognize that for many women, or perhaps even most women, they're more interested in the emotional intimacy aspect of things. And men need to be aware of that, and we'll devote an episode to that later. But like you said, today we're really honing in on the physical aspect of intimacy.
Yes, because for most men, pursuing a woman physically actually builds intimacy. And that's by design, and that's a good thing. But men need to be very intentional and purposeful about how they go about it.
There is a natural assumption that now that I've begun a romantic relationship, now that we're dating, the physical boundaries need to change.
Yeah, that is a implied assumption. That's a cultural assumption. It's just that seems to be the norm that, okay, we are dating, and so now there will be different physical boundaries. And we're actually going to challenge that notion.
Yeah, we are.
It's quite possible that the physical boundaries might not change at all, at least for a time.
And with, physical intimacy, really that should follow emotional intimacy. That should grow out of, you spending time together, getting to know one another.
Right. I mean, you think about it, you're not naturally going to be physically close with a stranger, right? So you build relationship, you build the emotional intimacy. And so naturally, yes, you should pursue the physical intimacy should come as a result of emotional intimacy.
Now, much like our last episode, defining physical boundaries in 2024 may seem to some people, archaic, very old-fashioned. Something that why would you even do that? And what I would say is I would challenge anyone who maybe feels a little, frustrated, annoyed, maybe their feathers are a bit ruffled by the concept of defining physical boundaries. I would challenge them and say, ask yourself, why do I feel this way? What is the problem? What is the downside of defining physical boundaries? Because let's be honest, in a post-Me Too world, there's actually a lot of wisdom. It's actually prudent for men to define those physical boundaries up front so they don't find themselves in a place where a woman can accuse them of something that they thought was socially acceptable, that's something that she would be okay with. And also from the Christian perspective, very important that the Christian look to the Word of God and see what He says regarding conducting ourselves in purity and holiness.
And let's be honest, at least very early on, for the first part of the relationship, there's very little upside to a guy pursuing a woman physically. More times than not, for the vast majority of times, it's going to be for self-serving reasons.
Sure.
It's something you want, it's a desire you have, you're doing it out of selfish motives. There's a time and a place for that later, but early on, you really need to be thinking about what's best for her and what's best for us.
Yes, and that is a challenge for a lot of men, particularly because there are so many cultural, subjective assumptions surrounding what physical boundaries should be when it comes to a romantic relationship. I mean, you've got anything from, holding hands, to, kissing on the cheek, kissing on the lips, to snuggling, to, full on making out, feeling one another up, to all the way to sex. And so you've got this broad spectrum of what our culture kind of deems as acceptable in a romantic relationship.
And as the relationship progresses, as we alluded to earlier, often the assumption is physically things will progress. And actually, that likely should not be the case. So as your relationship progresses in the early stages, physically, there's a very good chance that physically things should not progress at all.
Yeah.
And as the guy, that responsibility is on you to walk that out.
Definitely.
And figure out what that looks like.
Men should never assume that their definition of what is physically appropriate in a relationship is the same definition that she has for what's appropriate in a relationship. You're two different people. You have two different backgrounds, two different histories. You're two different sexes. And so to assume that can be very dangerous and actually create a lot of problems and tensions. I'll give just one very simple example here. Imagine that her background includes a history of sexual assault of some kind. Tragically, for many women, that's not an uncommon experience. So something as innocuous as, holding her hand to the man, you might be thinking, well, culturally, that's very acceptable. But to her, that could trigger who knows what kind of response based upon her history. So if you have a conversation up front where you've actually defined what is or is not acceptable, you're not then trying to navigate a bunch of unknowns as the man trying to feel out in the moment what is acceptable.
It would be a failure as a man to simply progress physically until she's uncomfortable.
Yes.
The goal is not to find where her comfort level is, the edge of her comfort level, and stop there. That's not what we're going for. The goal is for you as the guy to have boundaries and to know where that line is and bring her on board through conversation. Don't just figure out where her boundary is and meet her there.
Yep.
You got to figure out what's healthy, what's good for our relationship, and again, through conversation, bring her into that.
Now, there are many reasons why setting physical boundaries is important, but we've identified 3 that we're going to discuss today. And number 1 here is that men naturally are going to want to push physical boundaries. That is just, history shows that. Perhaps your own personal history for some of our listeners demonstrates that. And part of setting up those boundaries early on helps to safeguard you and the natural inclination that you have to want to push the boundary.
Now, to be fair, a guy will progress things physically as a natural outcome of his pursuit of a woman.
Of course.
That's a natural desire. That's a good desire.
Yeah.
It's got to be done in the right way at the right time. And figuring out early on where your boundaries are is really important because, once you're going down that road, you're not going to figure out where the healthy boundaries are once you're already well down that road with a woman.
Yeah, you don't want to discover what the boundary is by crossing it.
Exactly.
That's never a good thing. And what that can result in is her feeling disrespected. It can cause her to feel like you don't value her, that you're taking advantage of her, that you're only interested in gratifying your sexual urges with her. Or kind of on a more, sobering level, she could accuse you of unwarranted and unwanted physical touch, rightfully so, or she may even freak out on you just based upon her past experiences.
And there's the simple fact that men who show restraint and discretion in these areas actually are more attractive to her, to your friends, to community. You're actually more of an interesting man if you're able to show restraint, self-control, clarity around all of these issues. Where if you're just in it for what can I get out of this? Where's her comfort level? Man, this feels great. I like this. Guys who go down that road, honestly, are not that interesting.
And there's a tension there that men have to manage because they have to learn to be content apart from any sexual intimacy, while at the same time managing the fact that they have that sexual desire and drive. It's not like, well, by me being content, I'm suddenly a eunuch and have no sexual desire for her. That is a primary driver in why you're pursuing her. No one pursues a woman so that he can marry her and just sit on the couch and hold her hand for the rest of his life.
Exactly.
By design, men are created to be sexually driven, but towards a specific end, covenant and marriage.
Yes, it's not just I can pursue a woman physically at any time for any purpose whenever I so desire.
Yes. Now, number 2 here is for reasons why you want to set physical boundaries early on is because you want to honor her. And one of the best ways that you can honor her is by honoring her physically.
Yeah, you don't want to put an undue burden on her to make these decisions on where the lines are. As the man, do what you can to make those decisions. Take that burden off of her from even figuring that out. And so as the guy, put in the thought, the effort, so she can operate in a place of comfort and she can exist in a space where you're looking out for her and you're basically protecting her, and you've made these decisions, and that offloads that responsibility from her.
100%. And one of the ways that you honor her is by honoring her family, is by honoring your family, and by honoring the expectations with regards to any physical contact that either of your families may have when it comes to your relationship. Some good friends of ours recently got engaged. And I know that both of them, they're both in their 30s, mature Christians, awesome individuals, solid believers. And they got engaged. And I know that one of the things they talked about in kind of their dating phase was, what should our physical boundaries be? And the way that they determined those was they turned to their parents and said, what do you think? And again, for a lot of our listeners, they might push back on that and say, how dare you? You're your own independent person. Right. You're your own man. You're your own woman. You make the decisions. And what I love about their story is that while they could have easily have made their own decisions, they recognize that they're part of a community, they're part of a family, that they represent more than just themselves. And they wanted to conduct themselves in a way that not only honored one another and not only honored the Lord, but honored their families and their parents.
Because think about it, like, what's the downside? You don't get to do something that would satisfy you in some way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. I mean, only bitter, disgruntled, unhealthy people who get married are saying, you know what I wish I had done more of in my dating relationship? I wish I had done more physical activity with the other person.
Exactly.
It's like no healthy person saying that.
Only downside, and there's very little upside. So take in opinions of others. Worst case, you'll be totally fine.
Yes, exactly. Now, number 3 really is regarding the importance that the Bible plays for the Christian, for the believer, when it comes to setting physical boundaries. The Bible's very clear about the believer walking in purity and holiness. There's 3 references that I have here. There are many more, but 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Ephesians 5:3. But sexual immorality and any impurity or greed should not even be heard of among you, as is proper for saints. And finally, 1 Thessalonians 4:3-5. It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the pagans who do not know God. So the Bible is very clear that for those who have placed their faith in Jesus, and I know perhaps not all of our listeners come from a religious background or a Christian background, but for those who have placed their faith in Jesus, the Bible is very clear that we are to conduct ourselves, to have self-control over our bodies, and to live in a way that is honorable to the Lord and walks in purity. Now, very important, God designed sex. God designed sexual intimacy. God designed physical attraction. All of that is God designed, and he wants his creation to participate and to partake in that. However, it has to operate in the proper and healthy context, which is covenant, marriage between a man and a woman. And I think sometimes, when Christians begin to talk about physical boundaries and begin to talk about sexual purity, it's easy for people to assume, even other believers to assume, that sex is bad and sexual intimacy is bad and that physical attraction is bad and that being beautiful and wanting to sleep with somebody is all bad and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, no, that's not all bad unless it's acted upon in the improper, unhealthy context.
Right. It's not like it's bad until it's good.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
I'm not sure how that works.
Exactly.
But too often we actually can adopt that sort of thinking.
Yes. And so we have to recognize as Christians the beauty of sexual intimacy. I mean, there's an entire book in the Old Testament devoted to one man's expression of a woman's beauty and his sexual desire for her.
Yeah. Yeah, so with all this in mind, thinking about this, how does a guy determine what good boundaries are for him?
That is a very good question. And I think the first thing to note for a guy is that decision cannot be made in isolation. Isolation from her and isolation from authority and accountability. So let's start by talking about, the guy and kind of his perspective. Before he sits down with her, I actually think it's really important for men to articulate for themselves what boundaries should be. Because at the end of the day, you know your struggles. You know what you're prone to. You know perhaps in your past history where you failed. And so you need to be able to establish for yourself what physical boundaries you are going to adopt in a relationship. Now, just because you've established them doesn't mean that those won't change with either feedback from her or perhaps even more importantly, feedback from authority and accountability. But I think the first place to start is to sit down as the man and be able to identify what am I okay with and what should I avoid.
And the guy needs to be very intentional about not approaching it like, what can I do and still be okay? Or what line can I draw and she'll still be on board?
Yep.
The goal is not how far can I go?
Yes.
And that's too often the default approach that guys take.
Yeah, guys want to know how far can they push the boundary either with her or with the authority and accountability around them.
Yes. And full stop right there.
Yeah.
Start by saying what's best for the situation. What's going to be best for her?
Yep.
In business, they say it's not what you say yes to, it's what you say no to. And there are, in any given business, there's a lot of things that could work or could be good ideas, but you say no to them because it's not best for the company.
You have to do a cost-benefit analysis in that moment. What is the benefit of engaging in X, Y, or Z physical activity versus the cost to perhaps a future marriage or relationship?
Yeah. So, guys, you want to think about, okay, what's best, not what can I get away with or what is appropriate.
That is so good. Then I think the guy has to sit down with the woman. Very important. You want to hear her opinion. You want her to speak into this. It's very important to include her voice. But I do want to give a bit of a warning. She might be, just either based upon cultural background, based upon experience or history or just belief, be okay with certain boundaries that you're not okay with. As the man, do not compromise boundaries that you believe are important for you to walk in purity and holiness and to honor and respect her just because she's okay with a different boundary.
And a guy is going to be well served. So you can look at it two ways. If she's got a higher bar than you surpass that bar.
Yes.
You meet her and you go above it.
Definitely.
If she's got a lower bar than you don't go down to her bar. You bring her up to where your standard is.
That's an excellent point. And we're men. We're aware of the struggles that men have. And so I know that for a guy who likes a woman and she said yes and her community and parents have all said yes, that there is that desire to push the bar and to try to justify why X, Y, or Z is okay. And it's easy for a guy to be like, well, she says it's okay, so I mean, I feel like it's okay. I mean, you talk about like an Adam and Eve example here.
Bro,
she said eat the fruit, so I figured it was okay to eat the fruit. It's like, no. You don't set your standard based upon what she's comfortable with. You set the standard for what is right and what is appropriate.
Yes. If any guy is capitulating in such a way, it's like, bro, that's pretty lame.
Totally. Now, after you've sat down with her and you guys have identified together what the boundaries are, it is so important that each of you, either together or separately, go to your authority and accountability. You present what your boundaries are and ask for wisdom, input, and counsel, because I don't know how to like overemphasize this, but like men and women who are in a romantic pursuit of one another are not able to be objective, and they're biased towards a very specific outcome that benefits their emotional or physical desires.
Yeah, and guys have got to be on board from day one with heeding the advice given to them by mentors or peers that they don't agree with.
Yes.
And that's really hard to do, but weighing heavily the advice that someone gives you as it relates to boundaries is something that men need to take seriously.
And it is probably after initially kind of pursuing her, getting feedback from authority and accountability on the woman that you want to pursue, probably the next hardest thing for a guy to submit to is the physical boundary conversation. Because, again, it's so easy to justify why certain things are acceptable because, from the Christian perspective, well, that's not in the Bible. Or from a cultural perspective, everyone does it. Or from a us perspective, she's okay with it and I'm okay with it. But the goal is not to justify or try to figure out how far can I go. The goal is to live in such a way that she's honored, the Lord is honored, her family's honored, your family's honored, and you're able to set yourself up for the greatest possible success so that even if it doesn't lead towards marriage, towards covenant, you can walk away knowing that you conducted yourself in an honorable and pure way.
And an easy way, certainly not conclusively, but an easy way to check these sort of things, think about if she were to engage in a certain way with another guy and then ended up marrying you.
Yeah.
If you found out that she conducted herself in such a way with a guy, and then, would you be okay with that?
Sure.
Would it bother you, or would you wish it didn't happen? And then flip that around and apply it to yourself and think, okay, am I going to conduct myself in a way with her that for whatever reason, if things don't work out and she's with someone else, is that in any way going to be a negative?
Yeah. Now, we've got some recommendations for how we believe people should kind of establish some physical boundaries. We're not going to get super nitty gritty because we actually believe that you should sit down with each other and then with your authority and accountability, and together you guys figure that out. But we have some recommendations that we think will be helpful in setting you up for success. So the first recommendation here, avoid being alone in any kind of intimate setting. So that might be something like a bedroom or a living room or a basement.
Yep. For a lot of guys, that could be a car.
Yeah, it could be a car. Not my car, but there are cozier cars out there than mine.
There are.
Yes. It's really important that you don't end up alone. Again, we've shared this story before. A pastor came up back when we were in college, was doing a training with us as students, and he said, if I had to bet on hormones or the Holy Spirit, I'm going to bet on hormones every single time. Because the reality is when you are alone, kind of in that more intimate setting, man, the natural hormonal sexual desire, the natural attraction is going to lead you towards physical intimacy that you may originally have said, we're not going to do that. And so the way you set yourself up for success is to just not put yourself in that environment.
Exactly. And that's, to follow that line of thinking, nighttime. At night, avoid, again, our advice would be to avoid spending time with a woman at night.
Absolutely. I know that for probably many people, depending upon their vocation, or, whether they're students or not, perhaps nighttime is the only time, so to speak, that they're able to get together. And it's like, okay, if that truly is the only time you get to see each other, then make sure you're together with friends or family, that you're together with other people, that you're going out to a restaurant where there are other people, that you're not like the last two people at the bar at 1 o'clock in the morning, that you're not like in the park alone till 11 o'clock at night. Like, make sure that you've got other people around you, because then you're setting yourself up for success.
And you know, I've heard this before where guys will be like, yeah, well, you know, there just wasn't anyone else available, or it was the only time we could meet up. And it's like there are these convenient excuses somehow that, oh, look, it's the two of us alone together.
Yes.
You know, and it's like, really?
Or the classic, well, how am I supposed to get to know her if someone else is always around? And I'm like, well, go back and listen to our first, 10 episodes on how you get to know somebody prior to even pursuing them.
Yes, because, and we'll just revisit that real quickly, you spending alone time with somebody does not give you a genuine picture on who they are.
So true.
It's their very best. They get to present however they want.
Yep.
There are no external forces influencing anything. And so that's a very inaccurate picture anyway of who they are.
It's true. Another recommendation is to avoid situations that could lead towards additional physical or sexual activity. Again, we're not going to define what that is, because as soon as we do, you're going to get people who are going to push back and say, well, that's not true. That would never happen for me, or I've done that before and that's not what happened. So we're just going to say, hey, sit down with your authority and accountability and identify what that might be for you, because avoid those situations. Again, avoid the bedroom at 1 a.m. in the morning where you're alone together.
And something you need to be fully on board with is just because someone else can operate in a certain capacity does not mean that you can.
Yes.
Other guys might be able to ride in a car, be in a room. You know, there are situations where you might think, yeah, what's the big deal? Well, for you, it actually might be a big deal. And you need to be mature enough to actually own that and say, yeah, for me in this situation, this is a bad idea and I'm going to avoid it.
That's a really good point. Just to do a quick aside here, there are many examples in our lives where, with regards to entertainment, you know, music, movies, TV shows, books, or, you know, consuming of things like, you know, maybe alcohol or smoking cigars, where there are certain people who are like able to, you know, they're able to have a drink, they're able to smoke a cigar, they're able to listen to, I don't know, 50 Cent, or I don't know anybody in the music anymore.
It
was a big name. Post Malone, Taylor Swift, right? You know, able to listen to someone without it affecting them.
Yeah.
But for you, it may affect you. It may affect the way you view things or think about things or respond to things. It may cause you to actually sin.
Exactly.
And so we recognize that in many other areas, but oftentimes when it comes to a relationship, we try to be like, oh no, all macho man, I'm good with it. Dude, I can be around her and do anything and I'm totally fine.
It's too often discounted in this situation until it's too late.
Yes.
It's like, oh, I'm fine. Oh, whoops, how'd that happen?
Exactly. Now, our final recommendation is pretty straightforward. No sex.
Yes.
Again, until you've entered into covenant, God's design is that no sexual relations happen outside of marriage. Now, if you're not a Christian, if you're not religious, you're like, dude, that totally doesn't apply to me. I will just give you 3 very quick reasons why this should apply to you and why it's wisdom. Number 1, you avoid unintended pregnancy. And trust me, you don't want to walk that road. Number 2, you avoid any type of STD. Again, you don't want to walk down that road. And finally, number 3, you avoid any intimate, you know, bonding that can happen with a woman that you don't want to commit to, that you don't want to walk in relationship with for the rest of your life. And trust me, again, you don't want that as part of your history.
And practically speaking, as a guy, you're making it harder for you to actually pursue the woman in a healthy capacity. When a sexual desire or an appetite, when a sexual appetite is satisfied, well, when any appetite is satisfied, but specifically here, when it's sexually fulfilling, your drive and your motivation is reduced. And so you're gonna have a harder time being purposeful and intentional about pursuing a woman in a healthy way if that appetite is being met prematurely.
And I mean, you've mentioned this before on the podcast, there has to be something greater than just sexual gratification when it comes to a relationship that's going to sustain it long term. You've been married for how many years now?
Almost 15.
Almost 15. Okay. So in 15 years of marriage, it can't be simply sexual intimacy that holds the marriage together, because there are going to be moments and seasons where that might not be happening. And so it's like, well, what is going to sustain us longer term? There has to be a vision that's bigger than just fulfilling a physical desire.
Exactly. Sex does not keep a relationship together. It certainly helps maintain and build one.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. Now, we do have a bonus recommendation. What is our bonus recommendation?
Do not send inappropriate text, video, or pictures.
You know, it's funny that we even have to say this, but I mean, we've all heard the stories. Some of it's even been in the news where people do this. A good rule of thumb is do not send anything that you would not want sent on the group text.
Exactly. That will pretty quickly clear up what's inappropriate.
Yeah, like you don't
Had any questions?
Trust me, you do not want certain things ending up on that group text with your parents.
Exactly. If you're going to send something to her, and if your parents were to see it, you start sweating, inappropriate.
Definitely inappropriate. So I think that it's important that we just remind our listeners that the goal of this entire conversation is not to restrain the relationship. It's not to try to slow down anything. Actually, what we want to encourage is for there to be an acceleration of things in the relationship. Not physical things, but for the relationship to move towards covenant. Right now, I think culturally speaking, a lot of people have bought into the notion that, well, we date for, 3, 5, 7 years. Then we get engaged, and we're engaged for a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 before we get married. And by doing that, you're actually just setting yourself up for frustration because you're not able to actually ever act on the sexual desires that you have.
Yeah, a guy experiencing sexual frustration early on and even throughout a dating relationship is actually a good and I would say healthy thing for a guy to learn how to steward and maintain himself through these desires that he has. To have desires and to not act on them is a really good thing to practice. And what happens when a guy wants something, it's going to motivate him to act in a certain way. And so having these desires and not necessarily acting on them is going to actually be beneficial toward the relationship as a whole. It's going to keep you motivated. It's going to make you intentional and purposeful in your decisions, where if your desires and needs are being met, again, you're going to have less motivation, less drive to actually figure out where are we going and what is this about.
That's a great way of putting it. So as we conclude here, if you are in a relationship and you've not had a conversation with the other person regarding what your physical boundaries are, this week, within 7 days, you both need to sit down together and you need to have that conversation. Then you need to write down what those boundaries are and go to your authority and accountability and invite their feedback, counsel, and wisdom. And if you're not in a relationship or have been in a relationship in the past, it's never too early to begin planning out what your physical boundaries should be. Yes, you're going to obviously sit down with the woman one day that you end up pursuing and have that conversation with her. But right now you can begin to write out what those are. And you can even go to your authority and accountability and ask for their input and wisdom and counsel with regards to your physical boundaries. As always, we love having you here on the Art of Pursuit podcast, and we look forward to having you here next time.